What I am about to share is not something I am proud of at all. In fact, it's a story I have kept silent for years, something I've never told anyone because, even now, I cannot believe those thoughts were mine. Sometimes I wonder if it actually happened the way I remember it, or if my mind has distorted the facts over time. But one thing is certain. There are moments when the most terrifying thing is not what's outside, but what we carry within. It all started at a summer camp. I was 12 years old, an age when the world still seems full of possibilities and innocence hasn't yet been tainted by the harsher realities of life. It was my second year at that camp, a place deep in the Santa Cruz Mountains, surrounded by towering pine trees and crystal-clear rivers that wound through the landscape. It was a refuge, a place where we could be free, where the rules of the real world didn't seem to apply. The camp was run by a group of young people, most barely older than us, who seemed to live for those summers. They were our heroes, the ones who organized activities, taught us to climb trees, start campfires, and find our way through the woods. To us, the kids, they were invincible figures capable of solving any problem and keeping us safe from any danger. The first few days were just as they always were. We woke up early, had a quick breakfast in the communal dining hall, and then went out to explore. I remember how exciting it was to wake up to the sound of birds and the crunch of branches beneath our feet. We walked for hours, talking and laughing, with nothing to worry about except the next game or activity. It was a simple life, but one filled with joy. However, everything changed the day we decided to go on a longer hike and expedition that would take us farther than we had ever gone before. The plan was simple. We would set out in the morning, hike to a high point from which we could see the entire valley, and then return to camp before dark. We had done similar hikes before, but this time we wanted to push our limits. The day was perfect for an adventure. The sun shone brightly in a clear sky, and the cool mountain air filled our lungs with every breath. We set off in small groups, each led by a guide. My group consisted of 6 boys, all around the same age. Our guide was a 19-year-old we trusted completely. He had worked at the camp for years and knew the area like the back of his hand, or so we thought. The hike started without any issues. We ventured into the forest following a trail that was barely visible beneath a thick layer of fallen leaves. As we progressed, the landscape grew wilder, more untouched. The trees seemed taller, older, and the shadows they cast on the ground were deeper. We stopped occasionally to admire the view, pick up interesting rocks, or simply catch our breath. The first sign that something was wrong came when the sun began to set. Our guide, who until that moment had been the first to crack jokes and keep everyone's spirits high, started to seem uneasy. I noticed how his gaze became more anxious, how his steps quickened, more urgent. I asked if we were okay, if we were on the right path, and he assured me we were, that there was nothing to worry about. But something in his tone made me doubt him. That's when we realized we didn't know exactly where we were. The trail we had been following had vanished, and now we found ourselves in the middle of a forest that looked the same in every direction. It didn't matter where we looked. We were surrounded by tall trees and thick underbrush. We tried retracing our steps, but it seemed we had strayed from the path without realizing it. The first night was a test of patience. No one wanted to admit we were lost, but we all knew. We decided to stop and camp right where we were, hoping that morning would bring us a clearer perspective. Huddled under the trees, we tried to sleep, though the latent fear in the air made it nearly impossible. Every sound in the darkness, every crack of a branch or distant howl, made our hearts race. When dawn finally arrived, it didn't bring the relief we had hoped for. Instead of finding a clear path, everything seemed even more confusing. The forest, which had once been our playground, had now turned into an impenetrable maze. Our guide, who had been our source of security, began to show signs of desperation. He tried to hide it, but we could see it in his eyes, in the way his voice shook when he told us everything was going to be fine. That second day was torment. We walked in silence, directionless, hoping that at any moment we would find some trace of the camp. But with each passing hour, hope faded a little more. The food we had brought with us started to run out, and though we tried to ration it, we knew it wouldn't last long. Water was even more concerning. There were streams in the forest, but we didn't know if it was safe to drink from them. By evening, the tension in the group was palpable. Some of the boys began to argue, blaming each other for getting lost. I could feel the fear inside me turning into something darker, desperation like I had never felt before. It was in that moment, for the first time in my life, that I understood what true panic was. That second night was worse than the first. We could no longer pretend that everything was okay. We knew we were in serious trouble, and though our guide tried to remain calm, it was clear that he too was on the verge of losing it. We gathered around a small fire we had managed to light with difficulty, and we sat in silence watching the flames dance in the darkness. It was that night when the thoughts began to invade my mind. It wasn't something I had felt before, not an idea I recognized as my own. But it was there, latent, growing in the darkness like a shadow. I remember lying on the ground, staring up at the stars through the branches of the trees, when the idea suddenly struck me. What if we didn't make it out? What if we never found our way back? And worse, what would we do if we ran out of food? I tried to shake those thoughts off, telling myself that I shouldn't think that way, that someone would find us, that this couldn't end like this. But the longer time passed, the harder it was to ignore them. I thought about my family, about how worried they must be, about my friends who were with me, sharing this nightmare. And that's when the idea became clearer, more real. If we didn't make it out, if we didn't find food, would I be capable of? I don't even want to write it, but I can't deny that the thought crossed my mind. I didn't want it. I didn't seek it out, but there it was. I thought about what I would do to survive. I hated myself for thinking it, but I couldn't stop it. And the worst part was that, in a moment of weakness, in one of those whispered conversations in the dark, I mentioned it. I said it. I don't know if my words were taken seriously or if they thought it was a macabre joke, but I remember one of the boys looking at me in horror. That look haunts me to this day. The third morning arrived with a cold we hadn't felt before. We were all exhausted, both physically and mentally. The lack of sleep and constant worry had started to take its toll. I remember we could barely hold a conversation without our words dragging from fatigue. But despite everything, we kept walking because the alternative was to stay in an unfamiliar place, waiting for someone to find us, and that seemed even more terrifying. Our guide, though obviously tired, still tried to appear strong for us, but we knew he was just as lost as we were. His voice, once firm and confident, had become a shaky murmur every time he gave us instructions. It was becoming clear that he had no idea where we were, and worst of all, he didn't want to admit it. It was as if saying it out loud would somehow seal our fate. Fear, which had until then been a silent presence, began to manifest itself more physically. Hunger began to gnaw at us, a sensation that became more pronounced as the day went on. Our stomachs growled, constantly reminding us that the small rations we had left wouldn't sustain us for much longer. We didn't want to admit it, but we all knew. Time was running out. We wandered aimlessly for hours, following any trail that seemed to offer the slightest hope, but all we found were more trees, more underbrush, more of the same landscape repeated over and over. It seemed like the forest was mocking us, shifting and warping to ensure we never found our way back. Despair grew with each step, and though we tried to stay calm, it was impossible to ignore the fact that we were running out of options. By the time evening fell, a sense of defeat had settled over us. We no longer had the energy to argue or complain. We simply kept moving forward like automatons, hoping that something, anything, would lead us out of this maze. Then something happened that I will never forget. We were taking a break under a cluster of trees when the same boy who had looked at me in horror the night before approached me. "Did you really mean it?" he asked in a low voice, almost whispering, as if afraid the others would hear. His question caught me off guard. At first, I didn't know what he was referring to, but then I remembered what I had said in the dark the previous night. I remained silent, unable to respond, because deep down I knew I couldn't give an honest answer. I didn't want to admit it, not even to myself. But the idea had been lingering in my mind all day. What would we do if we didn't find food? How would we survive? It was a joke, I finally lied, trying to convince both him and myself, but I could see in his eyes that he didn't believe me, and deep down I didn't believe myself either. The boy simply nodded, with a look that was a mixture of fear and disgust, and then walked away, leaving me alone with my thoughts. The third night was the worst of all. The cold intensified, and the small fire we managed to light provided barely any warmth. We huddled together, trying to share what little heat we had, but it didn't help much. The hunger, which had been a constant annoyance during the day, had turned into agony. Every rumble of my stomach was a reminder of our dire situation, and every minute that passed without finding a way out was another step toward total despair. It was that night, under the frozen stars and with an empty stomach, that the dark thoughts invaded my mind once again. I tried to push them away, to focus on something else, but I couldn't. They were there, whispering at the back of my mind, reminding me of what I had said, what I had considered. I felt like a monster, someone who no longer recognized himself. How could I have reached this point? How could I have even considered something so horrible? But the truth is, in that moment, in that absolute darkness, those thoughts didn't seem so far-fetched. Hunger was like a poison, clouding my judgment, making me see my friends not as companions, but as possible solutions. I hated myself for thinking it. I hated myself for being so weak, but I couldn't help it. The idea was there, latent, growing with every minute that passed without finding a way out. Finally, in a desperate act, I decided to talk to the guide. I didn't know what I hoped to achieve, but I needed to get it off my mind. I needed someone else to share the burden. I found him sitting by the fire, staring at the flames with a blank expression on his face. "We have to do something," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "We can't keep going like this. We can't just sit here and wait to starve." The guide looked up at me, and for a moment I thought he was going to get angry, to tell me to stop talking nonsense. But instead, he just looked at me with a tired expression that I will never forget. "I know," was all he said before turning his gaze back to the fire. We didn't speak any more that night, but his words or lack of them only made my fear and desperation grow. If even he, the person we had trusted to guide us, was losing hope, what was left for us? How could we survive if even he didn't know what to do? The dawn of our fourth day lost in the woods arrived quietly, almost as if the sun was ashamed to shine on the place where we were. We were weak, exhausted, and the idea of continuing seemed almost impossible. But we had no other choice. We knew staying in one place wasn't an option. The only way to survive was to keep moving, searching for a path, anything that would lead us back to civilization. That day, conversations practically ceased. There was no energy left for jokes, not even for arguing. We were all trapped in our own thoughts, our own internal struggles. Sometimes, as we walked, I would hear one of the boys murmuring under his breath, praying or talking to himself, as if trying to find comfort in his own words. But for the most part, there was an oppressive silence that was only broken by the crunch of branches underfoot. I don't know how it was for the others, but for me, that day was a constant battle against my own inner demons. With each step, with each minute that passed without finding a way out, I felt myself slipping further and further into an abyss from which there would be no return. My thoughts, once fleeting and easy to ignore, had become a constant presence in my mind, growing, becoming more insistent, darker. I remember at one point, as we stopped to take a brief rest, one of the younger boys sat down next to me. He was pale, his lips were cracked, and his eyes were filled with a sadness I had never seen in him before. He tried to smile at me, but the smile quickly faded, replaced by an expression of pain. "I'm hungry," he said, in a voice that was barely audible. Those two words, so simple and so human, hit me like a hammer. They reminded me of the reality of our situation, the harsh truth of what we were facing. We were all hungry, a hunger that went beyond the simple desire to eat. It was a hunger that was beginning to consume us from within, that was starting to blur the lines between what was morally acceptable and what wasn't. "I know," I responded, my voice barely louder than his. "We're all hungry, but we have to keep going. Someone will find us." I tried to sound optimistic, tried to believe my own words, but I knew they were just that, empty words. I knew that if we didn't find a solution soon, the hunger that consumed us would eventually erode any trace of humanity we had left. That night, the fourth and final night of our personal hell, was when we finally hit rock bottom. We had wandered even farther from camp, venturing into terrain that was more dangerous and less familiar. The ground was uneven, with protruding roots and sharp rocks that made walking difficult. We constantly fell, our legs bruised and scraped, and every time one of us tripped, we stayed on the ground a little longer than we should have, as if the idea of getting back up had become an almost superhuman effort. We found a small clearing where we decided to stop for the night. The moon was high, and its cold light illuminated our makeshift camp. No one spoke as we prepared for the night. The silence was so deep I could hear the sound of my own breathing, quick and shallow, as if the very act of breathing had become an exhausting task. It was in that darkness, amid that terrifying silence, that I finally broke. I don't remember exactly how it happened, But suddenly I found myself speaking, almost shouting, letting out everything I had been repressing during those days in the woods. The words spilled out of my mouth before I could stop them, raw and unfiltered. "We can't keep going like this," I said, my voice trembling with a mix of desperation and fear. "We're not going to survive if we don't do something. We can't just wait here to starve." I remember the looks from the others, stunned, horrified. They knew what I meant, even though I didn't say it explicitly. They knew I had been thinking about it, just as I knew some of them had considered it too. But no one dared to say it out loud. No one wanted to cross that line, even though the line itself seemed to blur more with each passing minute. "We have to hold on," one of the boys said, but his voice was weak, as if he didn't even believe what he was saying. "And how?" I replied, my voice rising in a crescendo of desperation. "How are we going to hold on if we don't have food? We're dying here, and if we don't do something, we're not going to make it out of this damn forest." That's when our guide intervened. He had been sitting in silence, watching the scene with a look that was a mix of compassion and sadness. Finally, he stood up and walked over to me, placing a firm hand on my shoulder. "We're not going to do anything you're thinking," he said, his voice low but firm. "No matter how bad things get, we're not going to cross that line. Someone will find us, we have to believe that." I wanted to argue, I wanted to shout at him that he was wrong, that we couldn't keep living on false hopes. But the look in his eyes, the quiet determination in his voice stopped me. I knew he was right, but at the same time the desperation I felt was so overwhelming that I could hardly bear it. I was standing at the edge of an abyss, and I felt like one more step would send me tumbling into the void. In the end, I gave up. I collapsed to the ground, exhausted, defeated. I knew I couldn't keep going, but I also couldn't allow myself to do what I had been considering. I felt trapped, a prisoner of my own mind, unable to find a way out. I lay there, trembling as the tears I had been holding back for days finally streamed from my eyes. Our guide didn't say anything else. He just stood there watching me, waiting for the pain to pass. I don't know how long it took before I finally calmed down, but when I did, I felt empty, as if a part of me had been irreparably broken. I knew I would never be the same after that night. The dawn of the 5th day arrived unexpectedly. I had barely slept, and when the first ray of sunlight crossed the horizon, I didn't feel the relief I had hoped for. I felt like a ghost, trapped in a body I no longer recognized as my own. The other boys looked just as bad. Their faces were gaunt, their eyes hollow from lack of sleep and despair. We had reached a point where there was nothing left to say. Only silence remained, and in that silence, each of us wrestled with our own demons. The plan for that day was simple. Keep walking, keep moving forward, because the alternative was giving up, and none of us were willing to do that. Not yet. Though we were weak, the fear of the unknown, the fear of death, pushed us onward. It was as if an invisible force was compelling us to move, to put one foot in front of the other, even though we didn't know where we were going. We walked for hours, and with each step we took, hope faded a little more. We were no longer a group of friends, but a group of survivors united only by the need to stay alive. We stayed in a line, following the guide who, though he wouldn't admit it, was as lost as we were. He no longer spoke, just walked, his eyes fixed on the horizon, as if expecting something to appear before us at any moment, a trail, a sign, anything to indicate we were close to salvation. It was around midday when we finally saw it. At first I thought I was imagining things, that my mind, weakened by hunger and exhaustion, was playing tricks on me. But no, there it was. Off in the distance, a figure moving among the trees, slowly approaching us. We stopped, unable to believe that we had finally been found. Our guide was the first to react. Without saying a word, he started running toward the figure, and we, without thinking, followed him. I felt as though my legs could barely respond, but somehow I found the strength to run, to close the distance between us and that figure, which seemed to represent our last hope. When we finally reached the figure, I realized it wasn't a stranger. It was one of the camp guides, someone who had gone out to look for us. I don't remember much of what happened in those first moments. Everything became blurry, a mix of relief, tears, and exhaustion. All I know is that somehow they brought us back to the camp. The journey back was like waking up from a nightmare. We no longer had to worry about finding the way or about hunger or cold. We simply let ourselves be led, trusting that we were safe. But though we were physically out of danger, the weight of what we had experienced didn't disappear. When we arrived back at camp, the other boys were quickly taken to their respective areas to be looked after. But as for me, our guide took me aside and told me I needed to talk to someone. At first, I didn't understand, but soon I realized what was happening. Somehow they knew I had been struggling with something more than just the fear of being lost in the woods. They took me to a small cabin where one of the more experienced counselors was waiting for me. He was an older man with a kind but serious face. He asked me to sit down, and then he began to ask me questions. I don't remember exactly what he said, but somehow he knew what I had been thinking. He didn't say it outright, but his questions were aimed at bringing to light those dark thoughts I had been repressing. At first I tried to deny it, to tell him that everything was fine, that I had just been scared. But the more I spoke, the more I realized I couldn't keep hiding what had been going through my mind during those days in the forest. Finally, I broke down and told him everything. I told him about the thoughts, about the words I had said in the darkness, about how much I had hated myself for even considering it. The counselor didn't interrupt me. He just listened in silence, nodding occasionally. When I finished, I felt lighter, as though at least a part of the burden I had been carrying had been lifted. But at the same time, I knew that what I had said couldn't be easily forgotten or forgiven. The counselor told me that what had happened was something many people experience in extreme situations. He wasn't excusing my thoughts, but he was trying to help me understand that in desperate circumstances, the mind can play horrible tricks on us, pushing us to consider things we would normally never do. He assured me that I wasn't alone, that what had happened didn't define me, but that it was important to talk about it, not to let those thoughts consume me. I spent the rest of my time at camp under the counselor's supervision. They didn't leave me alone, and though they tried to make me feel comfortable, I knew they were worried about me. Sometimes I saw our guide, the boy who had been with us during those days, but we never talked about what had happened. We both knew there were things better left unsaid. When I finally returned home, my parents were so relieved to see me that they didn't ask many questions. I told them a very abridged version of what had happened, leaving out, of course, the darker details. I didn't want them to know what had really gone through my mind during those days in the forest. I didn't want them to see me differently, as someone capable of thinking such horrible things. The camp was canceled that summer, and I never went back. I don't think I could have, even if they had offered. What had happened in those mountains had become a scar in my mind, something I could never forget, no matter how hard I tried. Over time, I tried to move on, to leave behind what had happened. But there are nights, especially in winter, when the wind howls and the world outside turns dark and cold, when those thoughts creep back into my mind. I remember the faces of my friends, the faces of those I shared that experience with, and I wonder if any of them went through the same thing, if any of them had similar thoughts. And worse, I wonder if I will ever be able to forgive myself for what I thought, for what I considered. The guide who had been with us during those days was also affected by what had happened. I learned later that he had started seeing a psychologist after that summer. We never talked about it, but I suppose that what he saw, what happened to us, left a mark on him too. In some way, I think we share a silent bond, an understanding of what we had faced together, though we never openly discussed it. I don't know if I will ever be able to fully leave behind what happened in those mountains. It's a part of me, a part of my story, and although I wish I could forget it, I know that's not possible. The only thing I can do is learn to live with it, to accept that in moments of desperation the human mind can turn against itself, pushing us to dark places we didn't know we were capable of entering. And so, I carry this story with me, not as a burden but as a reminder of what we are capable of thinking, of doing, when circumstances push us to the limit. It's a story I will never share with anyone else, a story I will keep silent, because it's something I can't share without feeling like I'm losing a part of myself. I was a counselor at a science camp for 6th grade students. I'll keep the real name private for obvious reasons. It was 5 days and 4 nights in the Santa Cruz Mountains with a bunch of mostly well-behaved 6th graders. This was a pretty well-structured program, but every now and then, strange things happened. I was in charge of a group of boys in one of the cabins. One of the campers, who we'll call Matthias, was a strange kid to say the least. He always had this vacant, lost look, was unkempt, and you couldn't understand anything he mumbled. People avoided Matthias, and that seemed to be exactly what he wanted. Everyone ignored him completely, and Matthias didn't seem to care at all. In fact, He only got upset when people tried to socialize with him. He didn't want to talk, didn't want to play with others, nothing like that. Being around other kids seemed to put him in a bad mood, so we just let Matthias do his own thing, as long as it was appropriate and followed the rules, of course. After the first night, some of the campers in my cabin huddled together to discuss something. I asked them what was going on. They explained that Matthias had left the cabin the previous night very, very late, and didn't return until around 6 in the morning. What was he doing? I asked them. We don't know, they said. Did he seem okay? The kids went silent and uncomfortable, so I knew something was definitely wrong. I pressed for more details, but the boys clammed up. No one wanted to talk. All they said was that when he came back, he looked dirty and smelled terrible. This, of course, was very unsettling, so I asked Matthias about it during a very difficult conversation. Matthias denied all the accusations. I told him it wasn't safe to leave the cabin at night, and that he and everyone else had to stay inside after lights out. What were you doing out there? I asked. Did you go take a shower? Matthias turned his head to look at me but didn't respond. He just gave me a long, strange look as if he were evaluating my soul. It was really weird, but I couldn't do much more. If he didn't want to tell me, that was that. That night, I made sure to do an inspection after lights out. I found Matthias where I expected him to be, in his bunk, which gave me some relief. He might not have been talking, but at least we were communicating enough. It's not like I had anything against the kid. I didn't think anything negative about him. He had issues, just like everyone. I just couldn't allow him to sneak around the grounds at night, getting into who knows what. My real fear was that we'd wake up in the morning and he'd simply have disappeared, vanished without a trace. The next day, I get to my group, and they tell me Matthias had left again, shortly after my inspection, and had been out all night once more. We're talking hours and hours of being missing. Part of me panicked. I've worked at this camp for a while. I know the Sierra Nevada and what's out there, mountain lions and coyotes prowling the canyon, eager to run into a 12-year-old stumbling around in the dark. Besides the predators, there were also superstitions and legends in the area that kept swirling in my mind. Personally, I didn't want to consider anything paranormal, but let's just say a small part of me feared that the boy returning at dawn wasn't Matthias at all, but something pretending to be him. But I digress. I wasn't really sure what to believe at that point, whether the kids were just messing with Matthias or if he was actually doing who knows what the past 2 nights. We'd been through this before. Entire groups of kids blatantly lying about one of their peers just to ruin their camp experience. Sadly, it sometimes worked, so I was careful with what I listened to and believed. I spoke with some other camp authorities, and they talked to the boys. Matthias continued to deny everything, but the other boys insisted he had really gone out. There was no conclusive evidence either way. They were all reminded again about the need to stay inside, yada yada. But this time there was a warning. Anyone who accused someone next time had to provide proof, or they would be the ones getting into trouble. No excuses. I called it out for what it was, tattletales, and made it clear that if anyone didn't follow the rules, I'd take action against everyone. The third night, I reminded them again of our earlier conversation. I looked directly at Matthias and told him I'd be checking later, and that he needed to stay put. I got the usual grunts and nods from the rest. Everyone went to bed. No whispering, no stories. They just tried to follow orders as best they could. It was sad to see, but these kids needed to learn a small life lesson, and I was the one who had to teach it. Instead of doing a regular check, I settled in on the porch right outside the cabin door in my sleeping bag. No one touched that door all night. I was half asleep most of the time. I've worked at camps for so long that sleeping outside doesn't bother me at all. In fact, it was incredibly pleasant, and I can confidently say I didn't hear anything at all that night while I slept on the porch. I went inside and rounded up my campers for breakfast, and everyone was really stirred up the next morning. Matthias had done it again, and this time he had gone out the window. I couldn't believe it, having spent the entire night less than 10 feet from the very window they were talking about. I racked my brain trying to remember any sound, but I couldn't recall a thing. There was no way Matthias had slipped around me like that. Matthias muttered that he was innocent. The other boys were furious, exasperated that no one believed them. It was a crazy situation. Here's the kicker: every window in the cabin has 2 locks, one on the inside and one on the outside. This is to prevent exactly what the boys were claiming, that someone had snuck out in the middle of the night. Both locks had to be disengaged. I knew all the windows were locked that night because I checked them myself. If Matthias had gone out the window, he would have had to sneak out and unlock it from the outside first. The camp leaders brought Matthias and me to an office along with his school leader, a teacher, if I remember correctly, who was at the camp. We had another conversation, full of mumbles and a couple of phone calls home to Matthias's parents. From what I gathered from the conversation, Matthias's parents seemed a little odd too. They didn't talk much. In the end, they said they understood and even talked to their son a bit. Warnings were issued, and we moved on with our day. It's the last night at camp. One of the camp leaders gathered me and 2 other counselors. He said we were going to keep watch over the cabin all night if necessary. We were each going to take a position watching one corner of the cabin, and if we saw anything, we'd alert the others through walkie-talkies. If Matthias was sneaking out, we wanted to know where in the world he was going. Honestly, I still wasn't sure if this 11 or 12-year-old was really sneaking out or if the other campers were just making up the story, using Matthias as the target of their jokes. Around 1 in the morning, one of the other counselors alerted me. He had just seen one of the windows open. A minute later, someone was climbing out. My heart started racing. It was happening. Sure enough, it was Matthias. He slipped out and started moving. We all stayed back, giving him enough space to do whatever he was going to do. It was truly incredible sneaking around after this little boy in the middle of the night. With all the lies and all the time spent in the wilderness, I'd be lying if I said I wasn't intrigued by what we were about to discover. Matthias walked to the edge of the clearing that marked the camp area and headed toward another cabin, a girl's cabin. He walked right up to it, dropped to the ground, and slid under the cabin. The 4 of us were crouched by this point about 50 to 100 meters away. We looked at each other as if to say, "What the hell did we just see, and what the hell do we do now?" The camp leader who was with us said, "Okay, we need to go get him." We headed to the cabin and he pulled out his big maglite flashlight and crouched down to where Matthias had gone under. He called out, "Matthias, we know you're in there. Just come out now." After a few minutes and some more demands and threats, Matthias crawled out. He didn't say a word, didn't make eye contact, didn't look at any of us. Nothing we said provoked any response or reaction. It was almost like we weren't there at all, very, very unsettling. We took him back to the cabin, put him in bed, and saw some pretty satisfied faces on the other boys in his cabin as we tucked him in. I stayed in the cabin the rest of the night, sitting in a chair and keeping watch over Matthias. He never moved or made another sound, just stared at the ceiling with steady breathing, almost as if he were calculating in his mind, like he was thinking about what went wrong and how he got caught. The next day, all the schools were leaving. Matthias wasn't allowed to participate in any activities and had to stay in the office until his school left. The camp leader told me later that they had gone under the cabin early that morning and found Matthias's nest. There was some trash like candy bar wrappers, bags of chips, a dead bird, a dirty towel all under there, situated directly beneath a small gap or hole in the floor. No one knows exactly what he was doing down there. I'm sure you can theorize about what he was up to just as we did, but it honestly gave me chills. Get this, that dead bird had been nibbled on, and not in a way that a scavenger would have found the bird there. Parts would be missing if that were the case. This was like a little kid had just been sucking and lightly chewing on the top part. Very strange. Some of the maintenance guys who went down there later said they found a bunch of dead mice too with the same bite marks. I have no idea what happened to Matthias, but I will never forget that experience. It was an unforgettable story from my summer at camp. I have a road trip story, but it's strange because it wasn't a road trip I wanted to take at the time. The girl I was dating and I were going through a rough patch, and by that, I mean we were constantly fighting and even cheating on each other. Super toxic stuff amplified even more by excessive drinking. I'm sure you get the idea. After enough blow-ups and arguments, I finally decided to leave. My problem was I didn't have anywhere local to go. She and I had moved to the city and then broke up after just 6 months. I hadn't really made friends or connections solid enough to crash on someone's couch. That left me with one option after making that decision: to load all my stuff into the back of my junker and take that long drive back home. It was going to be a 19-hour drive, which I planned to split over 2 days. I had been driving for what felt like an eternity, with the endless road blurring into a never-ending nightmare for me. 8 hours in, I began to feel like I was trapped in some kind of automotive purgatory. The sun had already dipped below the horizon, casting a sickly yellow glow over the desolate landscape. I started to wonder if I'd ever find a place to rest my head. Maybe splitting the trip was a bad idea. I wasn't too familiar with the geography between my home and the city I was leaving behind. If you're curious, it was Nashville, but that's not really relevant to the story. It was the dead of night and I was about to get lost. The GPS had taken me down a winding road, with trees closing in around me like sentinels. I felt a chill run down my spine as I realized I was completely alone out there. I hadn't passed a single car in hours, and I hadn't seen anyone since I stopped for gas a few miles back. Still, the road was paved, thank God, but it was just a 2-lane road with traffic signs every few miles. It almost seemed too rudimentary to be a main road, but at this point I was committed. Plus, for some reason, I trusted the flickering GPS on my dashboard as I kept driving. However, the silence was starting to get to me. I turned on the radio, but all I could find was static and white noise. I tried to focus on the road itself, but my mind kept drifting back to the strange feeling that I was being watched, which was probably also due to the hangover from my lack of drug use. My ex and I were definitely alcoholics, but since moving to Nashville, we'd started dabbling in whatever drugs we could find on Whiskey Row. Now that my system was clean, I felt anxious and weird with a constant stream of sweat dripping down my forehead. I had only been on this trip for a few hours and I was already starting to feel like I was losing my grip on reality. The miles blurred together in a haze of exhaustion and complete boredom. I hadn't seen anything but fields and woods for hours. I started to wonder if I'd ever find civilization again, which was important to me. Aside from my paranoia, I wasn't brave enough to just stop and camp out in the middle of nowhere. I wanted to camp somewhere with streetlights, like a park or a Walmart in the next town I passed. As the darkness deepened, I began to feel a creeping sense of dread. I was alone, vulnerable, and completely at the mercy of the road. I pushed that thought aside and focused on the GPS, willing it to lead me to a safe, comfortable place. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I saw it. A dilapidated sign announcing the next town was just 30 miles away. The problem was that by now I was seriously exhausted, nearly falling asleep at the wheel and almost veering off the road from the fatigue. Because of how tired I was starting to get emotional. Part of me wanted to start crying, as my mind was plagued by thoughts of what I was really doing, forced to drive back across the country because my girlfriend had left me. The devastation was hitting me now, and all I wanted was to sleep. I looked out the passenger window and saw exactly what I wanted to see. A small cluster of rooftops up there in the woods. I was close enough at this point that the outlying communities were starting to pop up. I decided to go with it. There was no way I could drive another 30 miles, and people are people, so I figured I'd sleep there. I veered off the main road, my tires crunching over the gravel as I headed toward a small clearing. A single tree stood in the distance, its branches like skeletal fingers reaching toward the moon. The solitary sound of my engine echoed in the stillness. I was glad to have a bit of moonlight, as well as some space away from the houses. The last thing I wanted was to disturb one of the homeowners and have them call the cops or something. I turned off the headlights and drove purely by moonlight. That way, they wouldn't even see me coming up the road in my little sedan. I could pull off the road behind some grass or something and sleep until sunrise. As I approached the clump of trees, I noticed the small cabin next to it, its windows vacant, the door hanging crookedly from its hinges, almost screaming in protest. I shuddered, feeling a chill run down my spine. I stopped the car and just stared at it for a while. I hadn't expected there to be a building so close to the tree line, but there it was. The longer I looked at it, the more I could tell it was definitely abandoned. I hesitated for a moment, wondering if I should just keep driving, but the thought of another hour on the road was too much to bear. I approached the cabin, my heart pounding in my chest, and shut off the engine. The silence was oppressive, heavy with the weight of the unknown. My head was foggy with everything going on, essentially homeless on the road, miserable and trying to figure out the safest way to sleep in the woods. I wasn't really prepared for this kind of situation, but it was just for one night, so I'd make do. I sat there for a moment, trying to gather my courage. The cabin almost seemed to loom over me, its empty windows staring at me like cold, dead eyes. I knew I had to get out to stretch my legs and clear my head, but as I opened the door and stepped into the darkness, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was stepping into something sinister. Sure, it had to do with the creepy cabin I chose to spend the night near. And yes, I know any sensible person would have just slept in their car, but I'm a tall guy, about 6'2". And my car was packed to the brim with all my stuff from Nashville. There was no way to stretch out and relax with my height, so I had to sleep outside of my car. Fortunately, I'd packed my little hammock, one I'd had for years, one of those nylon things you can hang almost anywhere. I tied it to a tree on the hill next to the cabin so I'd have a view of the area, then started filling it with my bedding, a battery, a water bottle, and all the random things I might need throughout the night. I devoured a couple of peanut butter and jelly sandwiches and did my best to relax. The food did wonders for my nerves since I was literally shaking as I climbed into that hammock. After licking my fingers clean and mustering the courage to turn off my flashlight, I embraced the darkness and enjoyed the bright stars above me as I settled in for the night, trying to shake the unease that had taken hold of me. I started hearing strange noises. At first I thought it was just the wind whispering through the trees, but then I heard it again. The sound of raccoons chattering and scurrying through the underbrush. We had a ton of them in the town I used to live in. They'd come out of attics and all kinds of weird places to get into trash cans, even breaking into people's houses through doggy doors. I grew up around them, so I didn't feel scared, just annoyed that these raccoons were probably going to bug me all night. I put in my headphones and did my best to ignore them. However, the noise changed. I started hearing banging inside the cabin I thought was abandoned. Horror washed over me as I heard it, but after a few seconds I told myself it was just more of those raccoons or some other nighttime animal knocking around inside. I mean, it had no doors or windows. Literally anything could be inside. Again, I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just my imagination playing more tricks on me. But then I saw her, an old woman, her face a topography of wrinkles, her eyes gleaming with an otherworldly intensity. She hobbled to one of the empty windows and just stared out through the glassless portal. For a second I thought she was looking at me, but then I realized she was just staring down. Then she bent over and disappeared into the cabin for a moment. When she returned, she was dragging a heavy bag through the door and across the rickety wooden deck, the sound reverberating in the clearing like a death rattle. I was literally petrified. I couldn't have moved even if my life depended on it. I stayed there in my hammock, peeking over the nylon like a child as I swung between the trees. I was so grateful I'd hidden my car and was partially concealed where I was sleeping. My subtlety was keeping me out of sight. I watched her, completely fascinated. She was scattering handfuls of dog food at a rapid pace, and the raccoons converged on her, their eyes rolling in the darkness like tiny beads of water. For every raccoon I could see, there were a dozen eyes surrounding it, watching it move through the forest. I tried to call out to her to warn her about the danger that was descending on her, but my voice got stuck in my throat. Then they were everywhere. To my horror, I looked at the trees my hammock was tied to. The raccoons were descending down the trunks and onto my straps in full stampede mode. Some even stopped to look at me, curious about the new decoration in the woods. They didn't look for long, just enough to see I didn't have food, and then continued toward the strange gathering at the old woman's feet. The old woman's ritual was twisted, a dark midnight task of a complete stranger. I say that because she wasn't too kind to the animals. Yes, she was feeding them, but any raccoon that got too close to her feet was swatted on the head or kicked across the yard. She was openly abusing them while feeding them. It was the craziest thing I could imagine. The raccoons seemed drawn to her though, their eyes glowing with an unnatural hunger. As I watched, completely frozen in horror, she began to speak. Her voice was low and raspy, her words an insane chant that seemed to drain the very life from the air. It was total nonsense. Some of the words sounded like English, but most of it sounded foreign, if it was even a language. It sounded rough. I mean, it could have been German, but I know a few words in German and none of it sounded like that. Maybe Russian, I don't know, but it definitely wasn't anything I could understand. The raccoons didn't react to her speech, but by the rhythm and tone, you'd think she was casting a spell or something. It was creepy as hell, and I regretted not having driven straight into town. Then I did the dumbest thing I could do for some stupid reason. I whistled at this crazy old woman, invading her property and literally spying on her as she abused animals. I think my subconscious wanted to at least make an effort to let her know I was there, that I was an accidental spectator and just wanted to leave. She had no reaction to my whistle. It wasn't that loud, and not even the raccoons looked up from their frenzy over the dog food. I just kept lying there like the strangest voyeur you could imagine, and then it was over. She yelled at the raccoons and started kicking and swatting them, dragging the food back inside the house. The animals continued to crawl around the yard for a while, but the old woman disappeared as quickly as she had appeared. After about 20 minutes, even the raccoons started to disperse and slip back into the trees. It seemed like my moment to escape, but I couldn't do it. I couldn't move. You might notice I'm a big coward, and you'd be right. I just lay there telling myself some nonsense about how I'd leave as soon as the sun came up, because there was no way in hell I was going to try to break down my pathetic camp in the dark with that crazy woman just 40 feet away, doing God knows what, inside the darkness of an abandoned cabin, though I guess it clearly wasn't abandoned, since she had a massive bag of dog food stashed inside. I figured she was some crazy old hippie living off the grid, slowly losing her mind. Whatever the case, I was counting down the minutes until dawn. By my calculations, I had about 4 hours to get through. During that time, I just lay there. I think I dozed off a few times. I welcomed it, but each time, I woke up terrified that I had been snoring or farting or doing something to give away my position to anyone who might be lurking out there. I found it more comforting to stay awake and alert for whatever might happen. I even set a timer for when I would get up and start taking things down right before the first rays of sunlight hit me. But that never happened. I woke up again just as the first glimmers of light were starting to break over the mountain, but that wasn't what woke me. It was that same dragging sound coming from the house. I looked, and sure enough, the old woman was bringing the dog food back outside onto the porch. The raccoons came rushing back out into a lighter forest, and I could see there were even more now. It sounded like something out of a movie, dozens and dozens of them converging on this strange old woman. She was throwing handfuls as fast as she could and swatting at the raccoons that got too close. This went on for the same amount of time, 15 minutes maybe, but the sunlight was killing me. It went from black to dawn pretty quickly, and I knew if she stayed out for too long, she'd definitely see me in my hammock among the trees. And then it happened. While she was swatting the animals and talking in that strange language, she suddenly stood up and turned her whole body in the direction of my hammock. I froze, sinking into the nylon, and just did my best to pretend to be asleep. I had to look harmless, right? Then she did the creepiest thing you could imagine. This old woman whistled the same tune back to me, the one I had whistled earlier. That's when I knew she had heard that whistle. She had probably been aware of my presence these last few hours and had just hidden inside the cabin. It took everything not to pee myself or even vomit. The anxiety was reaching massive proportions at this point, and all the problems I thought I had earlier quickly dissolved under the weight of my current situation. She did the same thing, just dragged the dog food back inside the house and disappeared. Only this time I could make out portions of the inside. There was what looked like some kind of bed on the floor where she would lie down and just stay still. I wasted no time, truly scared for my life at this point. I didn't bother with any kind of organization. I just undid the straps and rolled everything up into that nylon hammock. From there, I ran as quietly as I could through the woods until I found my car parked exactly where I'd left it, still locked and undisturbed. I began to gain some confidence that I might actually live and get out of there. I tossed my gear in the trunk and jumped into the driver's seat, and it wasn't long before I was rolling through the tree line and back onto the main road. The morning light revealed something, though. It wasn't just one creepy little cabin. There were more of them, scattered across the wooded hillside. There was even smoke rising from the chimneys of a couple of them. I could see candles flickering in some of the back windows as I passed by the nearest cabin, the one I'd slept near. I could see the old woman crawling out the back door and onto the porch, howling after me like a dog. It was insane to watch, but I was just glad that's all she did. I kept slowly rolling away from the madness, and as I did, I took long looks in the rearview mirror behind me. Eventually, I saw a trio of people walking up toward the highest crest of the hill, their backs to the rising sun as they stared at me. They had that same kind of disheveled clothing, wild hair, and were pointing at my car, but they never chased me. I figured they were part of the commune I had accidentally disturbed, and that's what they had to be, right? Too creepy to be Amish, too settled to be homeless. They just gave off a weird cult vibe. That's how I left it in my memory. If you're ever driving northwest out of Nashville, keep an eye out for the dog food and the raccoons. One day I will never forget was the fall when terror came to our suburban community. It was a season of fresh air and vibrant colors, but also of indescribable horror. I'm a police officer, and I've seen my fair share of crime scenes, but nothing could have prepared me for what we found behind that familiar row of shops. This happened the same year my daughter won the state championship as the pitcher for her softball team, but that memory took a back seat. Unfortunately, the victim was an elderly local resident, a familiar face in our tight-knit community. He was found lying in a pool of his own blood, his head smashed beyond recognition. This guy was just an ordinary citizen around town, known for walking his dog in the morning and hanging around the post office, those kinds of things. The fact that someone would brutally attack him in this way was simply insane, completely out of the ordinary for our district. They even left the murder weapon behind, which was an old mailbox post. They had picked it up and struck this man at least 30 times. The brutality of the crime scene was shocking, even for an experienced veteran like me. The killer had a ferocity that seemed almost inhuman. Forensics and detectives were scratching their heads, but for us patrol officers, we had no idea where to even begin. There were a few cameras in the area, but nothing really useful. One of them caught our victim entering the area behind the shops around 6 in the morning, his usual time for a walk. They didn't show anyone else entering or leaving the area until an employee arrived around 8:30 a.m., which was when the body was discovered. Whoever killed this man either never left the area or left in some other way. I remember some of the guys in the locker room joking that aliens did it, but as the news of the murder spread, our community was shaken to its core. People were scared, and rightfully so. The idea of a killer living among us, hiding in plain sight, was simply unbearable. We worked tirelessly to find clues, but every avenue we explored seemed to lead to a dead end. The victim had no known enemies, no shady business, and no apparent motive for the attack. It was as if the killer had struck at random, leaving us with nothing to go on. Again, as a police officer, I've seen the worst of humanity, but this case was simply different. The sheer brutality of the crime and the senseless violence were unlike anything I had ever seen, and the fact that we had no leads, no suspects, no motive, it was almost like we were chasing a ghost. The days that followed were a whirlwind of activity as we worked relentlessly to solve the case. We set up perimeters, interviewed people in the area, scoured every inch of the crime scene for some kind of evidence, but nothing came to light. No clues, no suspects, no motive. It was as if the killer had simply vanished into thin air. The cameras, the questioning, none of it produced any results. We were drowning after 72 hours and the city council was breathing down our necks. Failure to solve the case would probably affect our budget for the following year, or at least that was the rumor. It felt like our lives were falling apart while the community was growing more anxious and we became more desperate. We started investigating known troublemakers, hoping to find some connection, any connection, to the crime. But every lead ended in a dead end. The detectives and officers working the case were getting spooked. We were all nervous, irritable, and frustrated. It wasn't until we interrogated this young punk named Alex that we got our first lead. He was a known troublemaker, always causing problems in the neighborhood as far back as anyone could remember. When we pressed him about the murder, he said something that caught our attention. "It was probably the weird guy who lives in the walls," he said, shrugging. "What did you say?" I asked, remembering how I looked up from my notebook with my jaw hanging open. "We don't know who he is, but he lives in the walls downtown," Alex said again. "What does that even mean?" I asked. "I don't know, man. He's impossible to follow. We tried to mug him one night, but he lost us around the corner, where that guy was murdered, really behind the breakfast place," Alex explained. "So you're saying there's a guy who can walk through walls in the area of our murder investigation?" I clarified. It sounded like a bunch of nonsense to me. "Yeah," was all he said. "Well, what does he look like?" Suddenly, Alex lost interest and didn't want to talk much anymore, so my partner and I pressed him a little. We played good cop, bad cop, and it didn't take long before we had a full timeline, description, and hours of activity. It turned out this guy was apparently some kind of celebrity among the local losers. He had shown up downtown a month earlier, seemingly out of nowhere. He was definitely a vagrant of some kind. He didn't ask for drugs, money, or even alcohol, not even a place to stay. He seemed to have his own agenda, and that's when some of the local youth decided they were going to rough him up and see what was in his pockets. That was the same night he disappeared between those buildings, earning the nickname Wall Walker. Apparently, he was a homeless guy who had been seen rummaging through dumpsters and bins, scavenging through trash. Looking back at the footage from the area, we actually had a few confirmed sightings of someone with similar behavior. We refocused our investigation on finding this mysterious individual. This was a huge relief, not only for the department but for every resident of our community. We set up surveillance near the crime scene, hoping to catch a glimpse of this mysterious stranger. Then, a few hours later, we got our first break. A figure matching the description walked right into view, his gaunt face and matching clothes unmistakable. We quickly mobilized the team to follow him, but just as the kid had told us earlier, he seemed to vanish into thin air. We searched the area, but there were no signs of him at all. We knew he had to be there, though. I could feel it in my gut. But this was also what he was known for doing, right? So we kept watching, hoping he'd make another appearance. And then, just as we were about to pack up and switch shifts with the incoming team, he showed up again. But this time, we were ready. He seemed to know every alleyway, every corner, and every hidden spot. But despite his apparent familiarity with the area, he seemed to be circling, as if he was waiting for someone or something, and then, just like that, we lost sight of him again. Was this the second or third time he disappeared? Well, here's the thing. He did it in the exact same area every time. There was a long building containing 2 different businesses, and across from it was a large outdoor refrigerator for the breakfast place. A big locked steel container, and then the cinder block wall behind that, running along the alley. They all converged to meet another business in a separate building, just a lot of little nooks and crannies. My team went down to this area, lit it up with all kinds of flashlights, and when we circled around, to our surprise, we found that man behind the refrigeration unit where the central cinder block wall was. There was a small hole at the bottom, just big enough for this guy to slip through. On the back side of that wall was a dumpster that looked like it was locked, but it actually wasn't. The pull bar was broken so anyone could open it. This explained the man's disappearing act. We continued exploring the lot and discovered he had a whole camp set up there, hidden in some bushes on the other side. It seemed he spent half his time hiding in the dumpster and the other half lounging at the outdoor camp. After we arrested him, we got the full story. His name was Roger, and he had recently been displaced for some other reason. From what I understood, it was a case of general mental illness. Roger was smart, like valedictorian smart, but he also had some kind of mental illness or maybe even drug dependency, perhaps both. He was too smart for his own good, so after a few years of normal work after college, Roger ended up going down the wrong path and just wandered after that. What happened that morning was something else. Roger had landed in town, not by design, but by pure randomness. He was hitchhiking, and they'd decided they'd had enough of him in our downtown district, so from there, Roger moved on and tried to find whatever opportunities he could around. As he wandered through the dark back alleys, he found that hole and that dumpster and began building his little decoy camp. He would use the secret pass to follow locals and try to rob them, then disappear through that little hole he had as long as they didn't see him go behind the refrigeration unit. The electric box for the fridge did an excellent job of covering up the missing 2 blocks. Roger had met our victim after living downtown for a week or 2, but that morning something had happened. The victim had purchased a scratch-off ticket at a 24-hour gas station, and it turned out he had won $5,000. He was walking around in complete disbelief, talking to himself out loud, waving the card. That's when Roger approached him. The victim kept talking about his good luck, taking a stroll behind the restaurant to start his journey home. Roger's quick thinking led him to grab the post and strike the victim, all so he could get his hands on that lottery ticket. We found it in his front right pocket, still unredeemed, probably waiting for everything to calm down before trying to collect the money. I went back to the crime scene the next day, and it was just Eerie standing there, right in the same spot as before, looking over to the side and seeing the top of the dumpster from the other side of that wall. Roger had been hiding in plain sight, what he called camping in the city throughout the entire investigation. How many times had we circled around him while he peered from the gaps and rusty holes, breathing and waiting for us to leave? He had been camped out there for a month and we had no idea. I'm still in the department today, but I've never seen another case even close to that one. I'm also grateful that it only took one sharp observation to solve that case, and that it didn't turn out to be more sinister. Roger is still serving time today and will be for the foreseeable future.